All right, so even though the discourse surrounding critical race theory has pretty much died down in the last couple of weeks as conservatives move on to their next pump and dump culture war scheme, the consequences for the narrative that conservatives were pushing surrounding critical race theory are here to stay. And I have a pretty egregious example here for you guys from the state of Texas, which we're about to get into. But first, let me just remind you guys about this entire critical race theory debate that was going on weeks ago. So critical race theory is a very specific lens of analysis whereby you analyze the history of laws within the United States and you say, how have these laws impacted minority communities within the United States over our history? Okay, it's not anything controversial. It's simply looking at previous laws within the United States, seeing how those have been weaponized against minority communities. And conservatives have basically taken this very specific lens of analysis that is only taught at the highest levels in, college and shit like that. They have basically taken this and twisted it to mean anything that is an honest reflection of the history of the United States, anything that is essentially not nationalist propaganda for the United States is somehow communist propaganda, and this is taking over our schools across the country. And this situation, this lie, this narrative that conservatives have been pushing surrounding critical race theory has basically led to a situation like this, where conservatives have been taking over school boards all around the country, and we end up with situations like this. So new from MSNBC News or NBC News, a school administrator in Southlake, Texas advised teachers last week that if they have a book about the Holocaust in their classroom, they should also have a book with an opposing perspective about the Holocaust. Okay, so let's just go ahead and listen to this leaked audio here of this school administrator describing to these teachers what they should be doing, because this shit is absolutely crazy.
We are in the middle of a political mess, and you are in the middle of a political mess. And so we just have to do the best that we can. And so we're going to go and you're going to do what you do best, and that's to teach kids.
I think we're all just really terrified.
I think you are terrified, and I wish I could take that away. I do. I can't do that. You are professionals. We hired you as professionals. We trust you with our children. So if you think the book is okay, then let's go with it. And whatever happens, we will fight it together. We will.
There's a lot of districts that are in the exact same spot we're in, and no one knows how to navigate these waters. I mean, no one.
As you go through, just try to remember the concepts of 3979 and make sure that if you have a book on the Holocaust, that you have one that has other.
How do you oppose the Holocaust?
Believe me, that's come up.
So number the stars, which is
All right, so basically, yeah, I mean, you get the point there. She's basically advising her teachers that you need to have opposing views on everything, even if one side of that debate has already been settled and it's an entirely irrelevant perspective to be giving, okay? So it's just disturbing, right? But they give a little bit more details here that I think it's important to focus in on. So Carroll Independent School District Executive of Curriculum, Gina Petty, says, make sure that you have a book on the Holocaust, that if you have a book on the Holocaust, that you have one that has an opposing, that has other perspectives. And they say, how do you oppose the Holocaust? And she says, believe me, that's come up. So meaning at the highest levels within the decisions that are being made about how they are going to engage with the law that we're about to get into here. But basically they're saying we have had conversations about this, and conservatives are literally specifically trying to push Holocaust denialism to be taught in our schools. Okay, that's where we're at right now in the United States. And again, this is not the only time that this has happened. We just had this story that came up just a couple months ago. Texas Senate passes a bill that removes the requirement to teach the Ku Klux Klan as morally wrong. Okay, so this is this entire game that conservatives and fascists have historically played. It's not just in our education sphere. Okay, this is something that can be applied at a broader scale, not just here in the United States, but historically around the world. This is a classic tactic that fascists use. They, under the guise of basically saying, well, we have to do this because we're pushing back against communist propaganda, right? Critical race theory, which never existed in the first place. There was no communist propaganda. It's not communist propaganda to give an honest analysis of the history of racist laws in the United States. That's not communist propaganda. But again, it's a classic tactic of fascists around the world to use pushing back against communism basically as an excuse to push their fascist agenda. Okay, and this is coming from the exact same conservatives who pretend to care about free speech and challenging ideas in the free marketplace of ideas. They're the same ones who support laws like this that are extremely restrictive on free speech. And you see it there in that clip where teachers are literally saying, we are terrified. We are terrified of what we can teach in our classroom out of fear that basically fascists are going to get mad at them and say, oh, you were teaching the Holocaust without being a Holocaust denier at the same time. So therefore, you're going to be fired from your job. So it's completely silencing to free speech. It's disturbing. But again, this is exactly where we are at right now in the United States. And I just want to read to you from the actual legislative text itself, so you understand the wording that they use in order to try to push this type of thing. So here's one important part that I soloed out here from this legislation. So, no teacher shall be compelled by a policy of any state agency, school district, campus, open enrollment, charter school, or school administration to discuss current events or widely debated and currently controversial issues of public policy or social affairs. So basically, in other words, anything that conservatives find offensive, meaning any honest analysis of the history of the United States and the dark shit that we have done, which there is almost a limitless amount to teach about, anything that conservatives might find offensive, teachers are not allowed to teach. But if they do choose to discuss these events, then teachers who choose to discuss current events or widely debated and currently controversial issues, again, an entirely arbitrary and subjective measure there, right? Widely debated and currently controversial issues, that could just be anything that they come up with in the moment. So basically, anything that is relevant to today of public policy or social affairs shall, to the best of their ability, strive to explore such issues from diverse and contending perspectives without giving deference to any one perspective. So if you see that, initially you might look at that and be like, okay, well, yeah, we don't want teachers to be extremely politically biased and be pushing some sort of agenda, whether it's, a leftist agenda or a conservative agenda. That seems pretty neutral. But no, what they're actually saying here, without giving deference to any one perspective, that's how you end up with a situation where teachers are teaching that the Ku Klux Klan was somehow morally neutral, okay? This is how we end up with situations where teachers are not allowed to describe the Holocaust as it happened, but instead they have to give some middle of the ground approach here when there is no middle of the ground approach that is valid in any way, shape, or form. So again, just using these same wording tactics here where they can't give deference to any one perspective, even though one perspective is the only correct perspective on some of these issues. But that's the type of language that they use to try to get away with some shit like this. And another interesting part at the end of this legislation, they say that you can't teach about meritocracy or traits such as hard work ethic are racist or sexist or were created by members of a particular race to oppress members of another race. So in other words, you cannot teach that capitalism was an immediate outgrowth of the system of slavery, right? You cannot have an honest discussion about this lie of meritocracy, right? Because in the United States, we don't have anything remotely close to a meritocracy unless you believe that Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are literally working billions of times harder than their average workers who are putting in countless hours and being underpaid for their labor. Basically, unless you are willing to dive headfirst into the lie of American meritocracy and pretend as if Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, and white Americans have all been given the exact same opportunities from the beginning of this country, unless you are willing to dive into that narrative, then you potentially could lose your job as a teacher, okay? That is what this is saying, that you cannot teach that meritocracy was set up by members of a particular race to oppress members of another race. Well, here's a fact. We don't live in a fucking meritocracy, and the system that we do have in the United States was literally created by members of a particular race, the white race, by the founding fathers of this country, and plenty of the institutions that we set up in this country were explicitly racist, okay, from the beginning of this country. So in other words, you can't have an honest discussion about the origin and the history of this country, or you may be potentially losing your job. So it's just completely ridiculous and obviously intended to suppress free speech and the freedom for teachers to actually give an honest history of the United States. This is just fascist propaganda, and I think Emma Vigilin actually had a good take on this. So she said, this happened days after the same school board voted to punish a teacher who had an anti-racism book in her classroom. Holocaust denial is a natural step in the anti-CRT project, obscure all power dynamics in history in order to keep kids committed to the dominant structure. And that's exactly what they were saying at the end of that legislation by saying you can't give an honest analysis of the lie of meritocracy throughout U.S. history. So this is completely ridiculous. Obviously, shouldn't have to say that at face value. If you're looking at the title of this video, I'm sure you know that it's ridiculous. Teachers are now being forced to teach that the KKK was morally neutral somehow and that the Holocaust may or may not have happened, okay? It's a completely absurd and ridiculous situation, but this is, like Emma Vigilin was just saying in that tweet that she just provided, This is the inevitable result of these culture war issues when conservatives weaponize something like CRT as if it's communist propaganda, okay? This is what happens. These are the inevitable consequences of these lies. And so we are going to continue seeing shit like this because conservatives are not giving up this fight on the school boards, okay? So I don't know what it's going to take. Maybe it takes leftists trying to semi-take over a lot of these school boards and push back against this bullshit, but this is completely unsustainable. We are basically approaching a situation where all of these conservative states with conservative state legislatures are going to be passing legislation that, unless you are teaching basically a nationalist, white supremacist propaganda in your schools, then you can't be a teacher.